Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second lecture of HUMA 1311. I'm going to jump right in the interest of time. I know there is a lot of content this first week, but I think the sooner we can kind of get through it, that'll give us so much more time to think about art and look at art and at least know the basics, right, of the story. So in our first lecture, we talked about the foundations of Mexican American history, talking about colonization from Spain, and its 300 years of cultural change and kind of integration that happened in what we now know as Mexico. We talked about the second wave of colonization with the United States, kind of clashing in the mid 1800s with the state of Mexico, the new nation of Mexico, and eventually the United States kind of winning out and kind of taking half of the territory, and it becoming what we now think of as southwestern United States, including Texas, and what that meant for those Mexican Americans who had been living in those lands that now were kind of dealing with being part of a new nation, having new neighbors in those Anglo settlers, who were, at first kind of attempting to build a slavery economy, but then after, hopefully the Civil War, know that history at least, really then dealing with post-slavery, dealing with this kind of westward expansion, and again, more and more U.S. settlers continuing to come into lands that were once owned by Mexican Americans, that were always kind of inhabited by indigenous peoples. And we kind of begin to see some of the layers, right, of possible complexity, layers of identity, given that for many mestizo or mixed blood Mexican Americans, they're both indigenous and Spanish, or European, indigenous and European, or indigenous European and African. We have this sort of beginning complexity, this confusion about identity. Who am I? Where do I belong? Am I indigenous? Am I Mexican? Am I Mexican American? We kind of see that question begin right there, begin to really become potent in that moment of colonization by the United States. Not that it wasn't, of course, critically important during the colony, the Spanish colonial era, but now in our context, we have these, as we said last time, this new orientation as a minority, who is simultaneously kind of exploited or oppressed, but also expected to assimilate. And that kind of, we're skipping a little bit, skipping the World War I and II era, although there's some really interesting history there, with Mexican Americans participating in World War II, at a disproportionate rate than white Americans. But this next kind of two periods I want to talk about today, or in this video, are kind of the 60s and onward and afterwards. So the 60s were really a tumultuous time in the United States. We had not only these different minority groups that were beginning to speak out, to end, at first end segregation legally, to end discrimination legally, with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. But this really inspiring a lot of different young communities to take up, to take their power and express their rights that they have as American United States citizens. So I mean, of course, we have the hippie movement, right? Mostly white Americans kind of rejecting the strict conservative norms of their parents, from the World War eras, ideas about, uh, you know, rock and roll, right? Music being more expressive, being more um, sort of interested in talking about drugs and love, free love, right? We had this sort of ongoing Cold War, right? All these proxy wars, Korea, Vietnam, that youth were beginning to protest very radically in the 60s. So this moment of the 60s for youth, at least, was a really both, again, like I say, tumultuous. There's a lot going on. It was chaotic, but also inspiring. Um, I'm kind of going to go through a few different places, different sort of locations in that moment, where Mexican Americans began to sort of come up uh, and protest their life conditions, and seek to create a new kind of identity. This idea of the Chicano, the Chicana. So one place where that was going on was in California with the farm workers. So, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, well-known names in Mexican American history, were kind of two organizers who were seeking to kind of unite farm workers, which sort of fell into the strange category of labor law, that weren't allowed to organize in the same way that other workers were. And so they were being exploited, particularly since many of them um, were minority cultures or were immigrants. Um, so as one group, the Filipino farm workers, began to be frustrated with their conditions, began to speak out. Many Mexican Americans saw similarities to their situation. They felt that it would be important to stand in solidarity with those movements. And so Chavez and Huerta, and this new organization called the United Farm Workers of America, this new union, began to organize, began to talk to workers in the fields, their families, their children that were out in the fields. I know my dad and his siblings grew up out in the fields in Texas, but trying to get people to share their stories of being exploited, being mistreated, dealing with racism, dealing with segregation, of not being allowed to go to white spaces, not having the same rights as white people. And they began to boycott. They began to fight back. So at first they were boycotting the grape farms, which is where the majority of workers were working. But this really gave birth, really inspired people across the nation, across the Southwest, to kind of become more active, to see the value in themselves and their struggle. And there were so many other actions that the UFW, United Farm Workers, partook in, like a march to the capital of California, the nonviolent tactics, fasting that Chavez did in the mid 60s, and really using art. And this is where we really see the kind of explosion of art on the United States, made by Mexican Americans who are trying to express this reality in the field, trying to express the realities in communities, and trying to make change, trying to create something better for their communities. So this is, so there's one kind of spark, right, in the 60s. Another spark, another place, another issue, La Alianza Federal de Mercedes in New Mexico. We have this group led by Reyes Lopez Tijerina, who was seeking to deal with the issue of land rights. This community and Tijerina was beginning to speak out against the kind of lack of honoring of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which we spoke about last time, which, if you remember, was the war between Mexico and the U.S. That led to the U.S. taking half of Mexico. In that treaty, that land, this Tierra Maria that they were fighting over, that was the ancestral land of the pueblo, of that community, was given to that land, given to that community, excuse me, as property, as their property. And yet at that moment, by the 1960s, 120 years later, it had begun to be sort of taken over by the United States, by US citizens, white citizens. And so this community began to speak out, though this time perhaps not necessarily nonviolently. They took up arms, and the group began to occupy the forest, occupy the land, until they were given it back. And a lot of complicated things happened as a result of this, but it really inspired people in the moment. It began to feel, as you're seeing, these little sparks began to come up in this moment in the mid-20th century that began to show movement, right? A movement, and talking about stolen land. Another spark was here in Texas, Crystal City, 1963, where you have this, as is common in South Texas, in this predominantly Mexican-American town, brown people living in the town that is actually, only run by whites. The community began to demand representation on the city council by elected officials, so that there could be Mexican Americans on the council to speak for their concerns. And they won. After sort of organizing, they were able to get 5 candidates in this year. Los cinco, right? I like that. For just a short term, but really, starting some movement. Even going to the point of founding a political party, La Raza Unida, which still exists, which is not neither Democrat nor Republic, but was our own party to represent Mexican American issues. So this was a powerful spark here in Texas, one of many that began to grow the movement. And also, as in Texas, in East LA, there were the walkouts, right? The students and teachers that were speaking out. So we have farm workers, we have community members, we have politics, but we also have educators and students who began to speak out, demand a change in the discrimination of the curriculum. Why is only white history taught? Why can't we learn about our own culture, our own histories? And as I mentioned earlier, in an earlier video, this continues to be an issue with Texas legislature, even now, fighting with ethnic studies professors to take this away, to ban this type of education. In 1968, they were demanding it. They were walking out 10,000 for a couple of weeks. Community members, family members supporting students and teachers that they teach, culturally appropriate curriculum, multiple heritages. And finally, another spark, one of many, but not finally, but one of many, the many most important ones was the National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference. In 1969, we had this kind of first conference of Mexican-American youth coming from all over the Southwest. And they were really arguing in this conference, at least the leaders, run this organization, Crusade for Justice, arguing that, it's cultural colonialism that's caused many of a Mexican-American community to abandon their communities. So internalize kind of colonization, where they feel ashamed of their heritage and they'd rather be, assimilated, be in the United States, be American, be white. So they were gathering to figure out what to do about that. And they came away with, obviously the connections and networks, but a plan, right? The Plan Espiritual de Aztlán. And I encourage you to click on the link and kind of read through some of it. Even just to get a sense of, their how fired up they were, how critical they were of the issues, and what their goals are, thinking about, uniting La Raza, thinking about, economic justice, about education, being liberated politically. I encourage you, it's not too long, take a look at that, really just to get a sense of the spirit of it, right? again, it's the spiritual plan of Aslan. And this term Aslan was born there by the poet, famous poet Alurista. So it was an artist, right, that came up with this kind of idea, this term of Aslan, which was that the Nahua, the Mexica, the Aztec had a homeland, that they were actually, historically, archaeologically, can be shown to be from the Southwest, from these lands where we lived anyways, that they left to eventually Mexico City or Tenochtitlan, and you have that myth, right, the legend of how they came and discovered what would be Mexico City one day, or would be Tenochtitlan. But this concept of this being, our homeland, that Aslan, the Chicanos are always been from this land, that we're not just immigrants necessarily, that we are proud descendants of a long lineage that have lived on this tierra for a long time. So again, hopefully you're getting a sense. I like the word spark, thinking of how people are getting fired up. And there were further conferences, particularly in Santa Barbara, where they begin to take on this term Chicano, this identity term, that we are Chicano, Chicana, which is originally a derogatory term, kind of saying like someone is savage or, indigenous. But this community, these youth, really trying to reclaim that and say, yeah, we are indigenous, we are from here. So many groups were created. I put this one, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aslan, was a student group, Mecha, that I was a part of even in college, but I think has actually recently changed their name and is on to better things. But as we reflect on this movement, again, just glossing over so much, we have this kind of new culture of Chicanismo that continues to today, that values activism, being involved in your community issues, that values indigenous heritage, acknowledging and taking pride in your indigenous roots alongside your Spanish roots, right? If you're mestizo, that values social justice, right? That the community can sort of live to the fullest of its potential, and that it has the opportunity, the social structures to do that. And most importantly, self-determination, right? That we can be in charge of our own future, that we don't have to continue to be underrepresented and oppressed. And so all of this is important as well for us, as I say, because of the importance of art in all of this movement, this protest movement, really centralized art making to sort of express these issues, express the reality of people's lives. It's also important because it was kind of the birth of Mexican American studies and Chicano studies departments. So all across the country, in colleges, universities, we had these new departments opening up that, like ours here at SAC, sought to investigate Mexican American history and realities, and keep it central in our academic research. So an important question, though, as we get towards the end here, is thinking about, did the movement end? So often scholars talk about the movement going from about 1960 to 1975. And you kind of see in that movement, in the moment of the late 70s, early 80s, that the tension that was always existed in the movement, between radicals, people who wanted to start over, start a new, way of life, new system, change the system, versus those who wanted to change from within to keep, the US social system, like politics or the education system, but change it from the inside. And that tension did kind of begin to take its toll on the movement. And as people grow older and had to deal with changes in society and culture, that kind of imploded a lot of those sparks. So it did a lot of good, and then people kind of had to kind of continue on as things do. They can't necessarily go on forever. And in the US, of course, the government clamped down on a lot of protests of Vietnam after the war ended. Another big part of this too, of this kind of imploding, the ending of the movement, was the 80s and this kind of rise, for various reasons, of Ronald Reagan, Reaganism, and the kind of promotion of individualism, not necessarily cultural heritage, cultural pride, but that we're individual consumers in a free market, that we should seek to kind of improve our material wealth, material good well-being. So for a lot of Mexican Americans and Chicanos who are not necessarily as politicized, obviously just trying to survive in impoverished or difficult conditions, a large group of the portion of the population, began to sort of assimilate into this growing culture of consumerism. And we see a lot of that today as almost the predominant cultural aspect of being Mexican American, or being anything in the United States right now. It's filtered through kind of corporations, through products that we buy, right? And not necessarily have that same sort of radical fervor of revolution, that in the same way that the Chicano movement had. So a lot has stayed the same in many ways, but a lot has also changed, worsened, in terms of the social conditions that Mexican Americans deal with. In the last 40 years, we've had an immense increase in migration from not just Mexico, but now other Central American, South American countries. So we have a greater diversity of now this term Latinos, right? That thinking about Latin America more broadly, we can have that continued exploitation of farm workers, which many continue to be. Many these of the new migrants kind of end up with service jobs or working class jobs predominantly. So we have a lot of sort of brown or Latin American descendant peoples continuing to have these kind of lower income jobs in the country. And yet we also have on all levels of working class, upper class, those that have been able to be successful economically, upper class. We have this assimilation, listening to American music more than Mexican music, or sort of American television and film becoming predominant, speaking English, right? Not necessarily knowing Spanish, not necessarily knowing religious or spiritual practices. So that's another thing that has changed over the last generation. And again, I argue that in many ways, you can sort of note a lack of critique now, that there's not necessarily that as loud of a radical group, a radical voice, as there was in the Chicano movement. It has changed, right? It's different. And we are inundated, as I say, with these things, with products in a different way than our ancestors were. So I see real quick, my battery's dying. So that being said, I do think that there are also some positives. There's a lot of new movements that are exciting, inspiring. We have gender LGBTQ equality movements, women's rights that weren't necessarily as present with earlier generations, which were very much patriarchal. We have support of migrants. We have this kind of dealing with the Trump backlash, this critique of being woke, and Mexican Americans being on either side of that clash. And we have this kind of desire to support indigenous peoples as we continue to reclaim indigenous heritage as Mexicans, as we look towards new issues like climate change. So we sort of leave us with this, is it time for a new plan? We have all of these competing and overlapping, intersecting, labels of who we might be. And I think doesn't necessarily have to be a resolution to that. I don't believe that there should be, personally, one that's right over the other. Many people have their own experiences and might align more with either of these histories. But it's good to know that they exist, why they exist, and allows us to see how this could become manifest in the art we're going to look at. So again, just a quick overview, quick look at that history. That being said, I hope you're all doing well, and I look forward to jumping into the artwork in the coming week. Have a good week.